So let's make a recap. So after knight c3 and then bishop b4, we close the center, and the move now is c5. Any Winawer player does this, it's the main move, and we attack the bishop. So after pawn takes, leaving the bishop for us to take, then we can take, pawn takes back, and the key move is queen g4, attacking the pawn. So we're going to quickly mention the other ways to block the queen from going to g7. So after, let's say, g6, white continues with knight f3, keeping an eye on e5, developing the knight. And now the two main moves that are played by the Winawer players will be queen c7 or knight c6. Both moves are coming anyway. Knight c6 immediately is punished by b5. The knight cannot take the pawn because it's protected. d4 is protected. b4 is also protected. Knight e7 will be really bad. And knight a5 will be just misplacing the knight. So let's go through this. So if black goes to e7, for example, this is, see how terrible this is. This is removing the black player possibility to develop the knight in g8. So it can't go to f6 because the pawn can't go to h6 because the bishop. And the black's ideal development of this knight in g8 will be to e7, but now that square is occupied. So bishop d3 is the next move. White continues development. So the only way for black to be able to develop this knight will be to e7. So after the logical move, when knight can't go to c6, he will have to go to, let's say, f5. Now white goes on by taking the pawn in c3. White is up the bishop pair. Black can't castle anywhere. It's got so much weakness on the dark squares. And so what happens if black tries to go on with development? Then simply we played queen a4, threatening a discover check, although it's not going to be like a very useful discover check, at least not at the moment. But the queen is going to a4 also for the main reason, which is to play g4 as soon as possible to attack the knight. If g4 happens, knight g7 and then bishop h6 will win the game for white. After rook to h8, g8, the knight will have access to g5. So this is completely over. White will have fun in this position. But of course we don't get to play again. So we are threatening g4, which will put this knight in an even more embarrassing square. How can black stop it? It looks like h5 could stop g4 from happening, but that now surrenders the dark squares forever. And now white can play bishop to g5 in a position that you play when the opponent has this type of structure, f7, g6, h5. For more information, you can check out my videos about how to beat fianchetto openings. And yeah, so the bishop here is threatening to just dominate by going to f6, and knight g5 moves are possible with an attack on the rook. Let's say, for example, black plays a developing move like queen to d7. White will have to go on with this move, bishop f6, attacking the rook, and after rook to g8, white continues with h3. The idea is to play g4, and after a bunch of swaps, white will have a rook on an open file, the knight infiltration in g5. The position is evaluated like something about plus 5 or 6 at the moment, I can't remember. Black can literally not move anything. The bishop could try and develop from the fianchetto, but still, whatever. Whites will just go on with move like g4. And the infiltration of the knight in g5 and then h7, with the possible removal of this bishop, the knight accessing f6. All of this seems very slow, but it's actually inevitable. Black has got no way to move any of these pawns without losing them. And in case of swap like the g4, pawn takes, then this is allowing the rook from infiltrating and to get support by the knight with an attack on f7. So from the beginning, bishop b4, we close the center, c5, we attack the bishop. Pawn takes, we take the bishop, black takes our piece back, and the key move is queen g4. We're going through g6 right now. This is met by knight f3, and earlier we saw how knight c6 comes with an attack immediately on the knight. So after queen to c7, which is another logical move, another thematic move of the Winawer, black is intending to play knight c6 afterward with an attack on the pawn, so the b5 wouldn't be a problem for black. And yeah, knight c6 is a move that will have to come anyway. So after queen c7, white plays queen to d4, putting more attack over c3. And then, yeah, what can black do? If black takes the pawn in b2, that's just helping our development of the bishop. and yeah, white is just better. Knight to c6 now, speeding up development, attacking the queen, is met by queen takes the pawn. And here this cheeky move that black can play is a strong move, and that I've personally encountered a lot, is d4. The knight in c6 is pain, so d4 is an attack here. And the idea is that, well, we can't take with the queen because of the knight, and if we take with the knight, which is the best move, this allows the queen from playing to play queen to e5 with check. Let's remember the white's got the bishop pair and the initiative, and also black will have nowhere safe the castle because of the g6 very weakening move. So black will have to play this move, which is the variation. It's a computer-like move. So queen e5 check is met by bishop to e3 with developing and saving the king. So now black shouldn't want to swap everything because the endgame is winning for white. White's got an open file already in the bishop pair. Queen can't take the knight because the bishop, so knight takes knight here will be a disaster. Knight takes knight is just game over. Queen takes back, we're skewering the queen and rook, so the queen will have to take us. If not, we also have ideas of bishop b5 check, and there's going to be a lot of attack over this diagonal. So after the queen swapped, we can play bishop takes, we have an attack on the rook, and the only way to block will be f6, and then we just play rook winning, more material, and white going for a winning endgame. In this position, black shouldn't take the knight. I mean, if he does, it's good. So after the normal development, like bishop to d7, for example, maybe idea of playing rook to c8 to come and attack on the queen, maybe castle. The idea that white has is f4. Also, let's mention that knight f6 here looks like a normal developing move. That will lose to f4 because now the queen's got nowhere to go. The white player has an idea of taking the knight, which will allow the attack of the queen over the knight in f6. So that cannot be allowed. And knight to e7 would be kind of similar because, well, f4 might come. And again, either the black player swaps everything and simplifies everything for white to win the endgame, or black will lose a lot of material. So after bishop d7 and f4, black preserves the possibility to go to g7 with the queen. So now this is already game over after knight b5. The knight has these two amazing squares to go to. Also an attack on the queen. So if black tries to simplify now, queen takes e3, no reason to panic. We're going to take with the pawn and still preserve the knight or the possibility to reach these winning squares. The best move now, the computer move, is rook to b8. Knight d7 also is a massive threat. Knight d6. So, well, rook c8 cannot go to the open file because of knight d6. So after rook to b8, knight to d6 happens, and the king will have to go to the attack on the knight, let's say presumably e7. If the king goes to d8, we got another fork. So after king to e7 attacking the knight continues by going to e4, threatening this super strong move, bishop c5, which will allow infiltration. So bishop c5, if the king moves to d6, then white goes to d6, and king moves on the diagonal. White has discovered check, king moves here, white has a fork. So definitely this move cannot be allowed. And even if the king goes to d8, still white's dominating. So after knight e4, the best move by black is b6, which stops bishop c5. White now continues with b5, attacking the knight. And the knight could either go to these two only squares, d8 or a5. In both cases, he is losing. Knight to d8 would be met by bishop to d4, attacking the rook. And, well, the knight cannot develop because we have two pieces attacking that square, f6. So after f6, saving the rook, white continues by taking the pawn in a7 with the rook, and it's completely over here. Black's position is falling apart. And just a few moves ago, if instead of going to d8, the knight goes to a5, which seems like it blocks the rook from the possibility to reach the 7th rank, white continues with the same plan. Bishop d4, attacking the rook. f6 only move because we have two pieces attacking f7, f6. And now white continues with c4. The idea is to play c5 and allow the infiltration of the rook over the file. So if pawn takes, and we can take back, and the knight will be defendless in there. And yeah, developing here, this knight will be impossible. Knight h6 is no possibility because of bishop takes here with the fork. So this knight is currently stuck. If king tries to develop by going to f7 to allow the knight to develop in another square, e5 just wins. Developing of the knight here would be just pointless. White has the possibility to push c6, so either black takes, and then that allows us to take back with the knight, to come with an attack on the rook, infiltrating on the 7th rank no matter what. If not, c6 pass pawn that wins the game. So from the beginning, there's another idea that black can try to do. So here we block in the center, c5 is met by a3 attacking the bishop, and in this video we're going through the pawn takes, leaving us the bishop. So we take the bishop and we get our knight taken. Queen g4 is the key move. Here, one of the moves is f8, king to f8, protecting the g7 square. This is met by the normal move, knight f3, usual move to keep an eye on e5 and develop the piece. After queen to c7, which is a normal move in order to prevent the harassment of the knight in c6 with b5, queen to c7 prepares an attack on e5, and the knight in c6 will come directly with an attack on e5. After queen to c7, thematic move is rook to a3, going for c3. This is just making life very easy for white. And let's quickly mention what happens if black tries this move. Pawn takes, then bishop takes. The queen might want to reach this square to c2, but yeah, that square is not accessible, and rook c3 is coming no matter what. Queen c2 is a move that I've encountered personally a bunch of times, and it's just a suicide. Rook takes, and now the queen idea, the black player might be to, like, find the perpetual after queen takes, but then queen takes bishop, but then rook takes comes with a check, and after the king moves, queen g5 wins. This cannot be backed by f6 because queen g7 is checkmate, and well, the king can't move to d7, for example, because of queen d8, and knight f6 would be the only move by black, and then rook takes rook. Of course, we're not going to take with check, because then pawn takes back comes with an attack on the queen, and then the black rook will have an attack on the rook. We will be losing. There is no perpetual here after queen b1 check, king to e2, and nothing happens now because we have two pieces here that can go back. The knight is still pinned in f6. It's completely over for black. Back in this position, in order not to lose the pawn, this will come with an attack anyway. Pawn takes might be a good chance for black to try and keep this game going on. But after bishop takes b2, now the black player has succeeded in putting our bishop in not a very good diagonal, because this bishop is obstructed by our own pawn, and also black didn't lose that material for nothing. Well, black doesn't have to go for that suicidal move, knight queen c2, but he can just develop the knight to be logical square in e7, and then knight g6, and try to play a normal game. White continues with bishop to d3, putting more defense over the square c2, because now that square was actually accessible, and the knight is protecting the bishop, so we didn't have that trick of rook c3. Bishop d3. After the knight moves, f5 or maybe g6, those could be ideas. Well, I mean, knight to g6, especially now that we have more attack over e5, will be met by the thematic h4, h5, and h5 by black to attack the queen does nothing after queen g3, because that just surrenders more weak squares around the black king. So, and besides, black doesn't have the possibility to play that kind of maneuver like rook h6, rook g6 to attack, because we have a strong bishop. So after knight to e5, f5, white continues with castling, and now white has the typical idea of playing h4, h5, h6. Black can't really play the move knight c6 without being harassed by the pawn, and then going through some trouble, like for example knight c6, b5. Then in this case we have too many defenders over e5, and after a move like knight to a5, then queen b4 makes a check, so that just can't happen. So after such a situation, black's attempt of playing h5 might be to come with the pawns and start an attack on the king side, because he can't really develop this knight. So now white continues with queen g5. Now this is not to say that these moves will happen, but the setup and the position and the pattern recognition is very important. If you don't happen to go through this exact move in every game and to remember the order, of course you're just going to remember the principles about it. So basically anytime I say the idea is, then that's something that applies to a lot of different positions that arise in the same setup. So in the French Winawer, these are the type of move we're going to be playing. So no matter the move order or when you see something weird, a move that you don't expect, just carry on according to how you're supposed to exploit weaknesses. Like queen g5 here, the queen is just safe. After h4, with the pawn trying to go in and try to create some disruption over the white king side, white can carry on by taking the knight with the bishop. But the main point is that we were going to take the knight anyway, regardless, because now white has this move e6, and we're going to have an attack on g7. So let's just quickly have a look at this scenario. How does this work? Well, bishop can't take the pawn because we have an attack on g7. It's going to be game over. If pawn takes in e6, white wins with rook to c3. And now we're going to remove the queen from the defense of the 7th rank here because we have an attack on the bishop. Potentially sacrifice the rook for the bishop just to get the queen to go to c8, and then we have access to g7. And if black plays f6, then we can sacrifice the bishop. Pawn takes, then we have check, and well, we also have an attack on the rook, so king cannot go to e8. After this move, white wins with e7. In this situation, let's mention another scenario very quickly. After pawn takes and bishop takes, we went through like this idea, knight e7, knight f5, and so on. What happens after knight c6? As we mentioned before, b5 will cause the knight to get disrupted from that position, as queen b4 threat is a thematic fork in this situation. What happens if the knight goes to e7? Well, this is not like theory. This is not the best move. I mean, it's kind of the only move you can play there. It's just to illustrate the problem of playing knight c6 and then the attack of the pawn in b5. This knight now is depriving this knight to go from the ideal square of development, and now white continues with bishop to d3. This could be, this is just also to illustrate a potential other type of development, knight to h6, for example, with an attack on the queen, especially exploiting that the bishop is no longer in c1, threatening a swap. Queen now just goes on to g5. We've seen this position, this type of position before. And now this doesn't look any good for black because black can't move anything. f6 would be taken, g6 will just create more weaknesses over the dark squares. The knight can literally go back and forth, but white will just go on pushing pawns on the king against the king's side. There's literally no access for this queen anywhere that makes sense, no infiltration, and potential moves like knight to f5 are attackable with g4. And also, let's not forget that this rook will literally never ever play. So instead of knight to h6, let's have a look at this other idea, which is h5. This is a much more natural looking move. Queen still goes on with queen g5, but still, what needs to be understood is that this rook still cannot play. Rook to h5 cannot go to g6, or the bishop cannot go to f6 because of the pawn. So black compromised everything by playing that move, knight to c6, in this specific setup. And just playing normal moves now to keep developing doesn't help. Bishop to d7, maybe and then we castle. Rook to c8, very normal looking move, is met by rook to a1. Nothing stops the white player now to capture in a7. a6 doesn't work because we have too many attackers to that. Alright, last line we're going to look at is after these moves, bishop b4, we close the center, and c5, we attack the bishop. And then pawn takes pawn, we take the bishop and we give the knight. Now key move is queen g4, and after queen e7, this is the move we're going to look at. This is a cheeky attempt of allowing the infiltration of the queen over g7, but that will come with the black queen going to b4, threatening discover check, which is really strong. White has to play pawn takes pawn, stopping all of that from happening and renewing the threat in g7. Now black's best move will be f6. The idea is to defend g7 with the queen. And white, of course, doesn't take f6 because we don't want to help black develop. So knight f3 now, preserving the knight from the possibility to reach this amazing e5 square. So after knight to c6, white continues with bishop to d3. Looks like a very normal move, and it looks like this is the one that black has the most chances of playing a normal game, unlike all the variations before where every single inaccuracy was punished. Bishop to d7, and now white will just castle. So it looks like black is able to castle, but castling alongside is a mistake now because of b5. And now nothing stops the infiltration of the rook in a7. It's completely compromised. So black cannot castle, at least not right now. What happens after the seemingly free pawn in e5? White takes it, and after pawn takes back, white gives a check. G6 is not possible because bishop G6 is checked, and the pawn takes back will be met by queen takes rook, a pattern we're all familiar with. So after this check, the king will have to move. Well, black can block with the bishop, with the queen in f7, but that will allow the white player to have a queen in e5, keeping an eye on g7, this diagonal, and also having a lot of power over the diagonal of the queen side, and the queen will be just better. White's position is evaluated like over a piece up in this position. So, well, okay, if that happens, then what happens after queen takes, and then black continues with normal development, maybe castling short side? Well, now, simply, the rook will be able to take in a7. Rook takes. The rook can also threaten to take in b7, and this is completely winning for white. White also has the bishop pair. If rook takes back, we're going to spoil the castle from the black player. Will recapture the rook as well. So what happens in this position if instead of knight f6, black tries to swap like this? Then queen to c7, defending c3 further, attacking the pawn, and still renewing potential threat of playing a similar move. Well, not right now, because the queen has got access to d8, so we wouldn't be able to play rook a7 right now, but we are going to take this pawn. And if the pawn moves, then we have two pieces attacking a7. So queen to d8, looking desperately for a swap, will just be met by queen to b7. White is completely winning the endgame. So if black sees all of this after queen to h5 check, and black plays, I don't know, king to d8, then again, queen to e5 comes anyway. We still have pressure on g7. Knight to f6, normal looking move is met by bishop to e3, renewing the attack over a7. So what happens after a move like a6? Stopping all that. Well, b6 wasn't possible because then the pawn in a7 is pinned, can't take back. So after a6, bishop goes to c5, attacking the queen, and now the queen will have to move. Queen to f7, for instance, is met by b5. That wins for the black player. It's just too strong. We have double attack over this pawn. We're going to produce a passed pawn. The pawn is pinned, cannot take back without the rook falling. And if the queen actually goes to e8 to put more defense over b5 so that we cannot push it, white continues with queen to d6, threatening checkmate soon. So how does black stop it? Well, rook to c8 doesn't work because he's still going to play bishop check and then win later. Best move now, according to the engine, is queen f7 to give a free square for the king to go. But still, white now will go on with b5.